This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with two of the founding members of the newly launched Department of African Diaspora Studies at Grinnell College, Makeba Lavan and Stephanie Jones. Professor Lavan teaches in the English department at Grinnell with a special interest in afrofuturist literature and culture. Professor Jones teaches in the Education Studies department with a focus on the relation between race, curriculum, and trauma in Black students. In this conversation, we discuss their journeys into an abiding concern with Black life, what sustains that concern, and how multiple disciplinary approaches to Black studies expand and deepen the field. Hello, Stephanie and Makeba. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. Really happy to see you all here. How are you doing?
Doing great, John. It's good to see you.
Good. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have this chance to talk with both of you for a number of reasons. I mean, I think the work that both of you do is super interesting and super important and very different in terms of methods and orientations. So thinking together, the three of us, about Black studies and really hearing the two of you talk about the field of Black studies and where your work fits in and where it extends and changes, but also is embedded in the tradition, I think will be really interesting. And also, of course, because the two of you were really at the center of starting the Black Studies program at Grinnell College. We worked together a little bit on it, but I know you two put in so much work. And so for me, I think there's something particularly interesting about talking Black studies with people who got a program up and running, had to pitch it, had to conceive a faculty, had to have a vision. And so very excited to talk to you all. And I think that the perspective that you all have is going to be a really interesting and important addition to the series. So as a way of getting started, I wanted to not so much start with particular questions about your research in the field of Black studies, but really to ask you to narrate, both of you to narrate your intellectual journeys in some way. What is it that drew you to Black studies and more broadly to the study of Black life? Because, something draws us there, but also some kind of interest, some kind of commitments and passions also sustain us. And so I'm interested to hear, how you got here and what sort of values, what sort of commitments animate your work on Black life. Maybe start with you, Stephanie.
Thanks for that question. After listening to the very first episode of this series, I realized, John, that our intellectual journeys have a little bit in common. I went to University of Pittsburgh undergrad, and I was a philosophy and rhetoric major there. Oh. And I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I was there having a good time, I was always very interested in the questions behind the questions, the whys of everything. What do we think about these certain concepts? How does that, help rule our lives and the ways that our lives are structured? And I thought that was the closest way that I could figure out the answer to these questions by majoring in these things. But towards the end of my undergraduate, I realized that, what am I going to do with this degree?
That's a question with both rhetoric and philosophy.
with both of these, I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. But I've always thought about becoming a teacher. And at that time, University of Pittsburgh had what they called a professional year or a fifth year program that allowed you to earn a teaching certification in a discipline and do your student teaching and become licensed within 1 year post-graduation. Mm-hmm. So I did that program and decided to go into English language arts teaching for high school. And so I did a bunch of different, classes and coursework in, obviously, English, and then in teacher education specifically. And then I became a high school English teacher. I relocated back home to Atlanta, and I taught primarily 11th grade American literature. in the city of Atlanta. And toward probably like my fifth year of teaching, my old advisor from my teaching program said, "Hey, when are you going to go get your PhD?" I'm like, "I'm not interested in that. We're rocking out with this Great Gatsby. We're doing our thing out here." Thinking I was doing something really relevant, right? Just like, hey, we're getting good scores on these state assessments. This is all that matters. That was my purview. But I was like, well, maybe I'll go check it out and see. But I didn't know anything about what a PhD was. How do you do it? No one in my family has ever gone through this process. And I was able to go and talk with the professor that eventually became my advisor. And she's asking me all of these questions that you would ask a traditional doctoral student. And I don't know the answer to any of them. No, I don't know what my research interests are. No, I don't know what journals I want to publish in. And she said, "Oh, okay." But she still gave me a chance because I think I was interested in the fact that you literally can do this for a living, just think and write and speak about things. And I said, okay, I think I like this. So I started a PhD program in language and literacy education. And going through that PhD program and realized that the majority of whom they were talking about inside of these classrooms and who they always centered as being the problem were the children that I taught. And so, either our children can't read, they're not literate, we need to make all of these provisions. And I'm thinking, like, I leave every day from that school to come and be with you all, and this is not the reality that I see. And I graduated from University of Georgia, and I wrote my dissertation on young Black girls and women who read urban fiction as their primary reading choices for themselves, and how they were learning how to navigate Black womanhood because of reading these texts. And I started at Grinnell College in 2016. And honestly, I have not touched that research since 2016. Mainly because something else happened that really shifted my research trajectory. And this is where our stories start to lock in together, John, is that I started thinking about what my experience was growing up in predominantly white schools all my life, and realized that there were some things that happened to me that should not have happened. And I realized that that's a running thread of a lot of the listeners on your show. I mean, a lot of the guests on your show, realizing that they did not get the type of education that they needed to, especially around the study of Black life. And I always give this example of, I had a teacher in elementary school that wanted to do a unit on colonial America. And one of those pieces in colonial America was she wanted her students to know what it was like to be enslaved. And so her idea of doing an assessment was to bring in cotton plants to each of the students and have us pick cotton. And that lesson stayed with me, not because at that time I'm realizing, okay, this is really kind of messed up, but I'm thinking, I wonder if people still think the way that she thought about how to teach this. And that's what I started documenting, and that's what I started researching. So now my research is fully focused on what I call racialized trauma in schools, and specifically curriculum violence, where we're having teachers in public, private, parochial, vacation Bible school, it doesn't matter, using curriculum or creating curriculum that is harmful to students. And so now I'm at the point where I'm realizing that the study of Black life, the study, like Black studies as a discipline, was something that I never received, and I never was introduced to it in any capacity in my life, other than, just being Black. That's the Black study that I got, but I didn't know about it like in the academic sense of the word. So now I'm in a space where I am now relearning what I should have learned about Black studies in general. So that's a short run on my intellectual journey thus far.
Yeah, that phrase, curricular violence. I mean, I know you're thinking primarily about K through 12, but that's all the way through PhD.
All the way.
I mean, that's
all the way. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, there was, something about my own education, which was great books, European, so Eurocentric. We didn't even talk about England or the white US. And, as a white person, I wouldn't describe it as traumatic, but it has its own kind of rupture in the sense of like really disconnecting you from the world you actually live in. And, that, thinking about curriculum that doesn't even repair necessarily, but even just has a connection is, I think Black studies, no matter whether you're a social scientist, quantitative person, qualitative person, or humanist, that lies at the center of so much of that stuff that we do. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Makeba, how about you?
So my experience is a bit different. I grew up in the Bronx, reading mostly Black literature. It was actually to the point where one of the things I remember reading as a young girl is Octavia Butler's books, particularly the Xenogenesis series. I had to have been like 9 or 10. I don't know where I got these books. They were just on the family library. But one of my first memories is, our living room, which had like a huge poster of ancient African kingdoms. And I was taught about them. And I learned how to read with books like Mafaro's Beautiful Daughters. And so it wasn't until I went to, college that I realized this wasn't the experience most Black people had, I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, but I grew up in a family and in communities where we were always discussing what was happening in the world and our place, where Black people found our places in it. But I had a pretty non-traditional path to education. I didn't go to college until I was 25. I basically spent the years between 18 and 25 working at a criminal justice nonprofit, working with young people who had parents who were in prison, taking them to go see their parents, advocating, in front of the Senate and Congress and going to all these different meetings about laws and how we can sort of keep families together and reduce recidivism through familial contact, which, as you know, is a conversation that is still ongoing and even more important today. And that pretty much showed me in a very concrete way the inequities of our society. And so one of the places that I worked was the family center at Sing Sing. And so I was responsible for making sure there was, a person there to moderate between the children and the men who were incarcerated. And it was very interesting because Sing Sing is located in Ossining, where Don Draper lives in Mad Men, but it's not mentioned at all. So like when I was watching Mad Men, just for shits and giggles, and they mentioned that they live in Ossining, it's like this white picket fence town, and this max prison that was built in 1825 was never mentioned. It was very interesting, but I think that's sort of like a metaphor for how our country runs, right? Yeah. It's like, these two very different realities. I'm, doing this social justice stuff for about 15 years, and then I go to college because I was tired of not being taken seriously. I was, young. I was a youth ambassador. That was literally my job description title. And, some of the older, more senior people were like, what is this young girl doing? What are we, she doesn't even have a degree. So I was like, I'll show you because I am fueled by pettiness. And I'm like, I'm going to go and get my degree. So I went to John Jay College of Criminal Justice for obvious reasons. By
the way, I think there's a collection of essays for people to write about fueled by pettiness and their achievements in academia. But sorry to interrupt you, but I was like, I love that.
No, I agree.
Book title.
I agree. I would love to edit and contribute. So that's something to think about for the future. So, at 25, I'm like, I'm going to get this social justice degree, this criminal justice degree, and then I'll be taken seriously in this field that I've already been in for almost 10 years, And then I took one English class with Mitchell Jackson, who's now a Pulitzer Prize winner. And that was all she wrote. It's like, forget criminal justice. I don't want to do this anymore. And so I continued on with English. Somebody put me on to the McNair Scholars, and they're like, basically, you're so nerdy, PhD would be good for you. You have all these questions, you never follow the prompts of the class, but you always have very interesting things to say. Like, maybe you should consider doing this for a living. And I met with my advisor, Liza, and, I was like, I don't know what to write about. Same thing that Stephanie said, but I really am thinking about, she's like, what are you interested in? We were at this burger joint in Harlem. She's like, what interests you? And I was like, well, I love Octavia Butler. And she's like, why don't you write about that? And I was like, what? Like, no one had ever told me that, And so that's exactly what I did. I wrote my thesis on Octavia Butler and like the Hegelian struggle. Also something I've never come back to. And then I, applied for graduate schools. I didn't get into any of them. And then I was like, okay, I need to like focus on what I actually want to do and where I actually want to be. And so I went to all these different programs. Do you study Black science fiction? That's what I want to do. And almost all of them were like, no, we don't do that. But here's like a nice white feminist and you can work with her. And it was like, they're not the same at all. So the only place that was doing work similarly to what I wanted to do was the CUNY Graduate Center, which is exactly where I didn't want to be because I wanted to leave New York for once. Yeah. But it worked out because, everyone I ended up working with was incredible. And I got to do exactly the work that I wanted to do, which was what became known as afrofuturism. And really study how Black people, as Octavia Butler says, write themselves in, not just, the present, but the past and the future. Yeah. And that got me all the way through graduate school. And then I got a visiting assistant professorship here at Grinnell. I was only supposed to stay a year. And then I ended up getting the tenure track position. And then a couple of years ago, when we were all sitting at home, I realized I was watching a lot of television, which is not abnormal for me because I've always been interested in media studies. But I was seeing all these commercials with these mixed race families. And then I saw a lot of people on social media talking about these mixed race families. Like, why are there so many mixed race families? Like, what's happening? And I got really fascinated by that because I wanted to figure out what society was trying to tell us in a moment of sort of anti-identity, anti-DEI, anti-woke, why are we seeing all of these things on the rise at the same time that we're seeing these like mixed race families? And that became my current project, which I'm hoping will be a book project that I'm titling Miscegenation Nation. And that's what I work on now. That's kind of the trajectory. And it's not as far as a departure from the Afrofuturism as it seems, because my foundational question for both of these things is, how do Black people see ourselves and exist and survive and thrive in the future? And I think if we're seeing a lot of these mixed race representation, there's something very sinister happening there with how we are erasing Blackness from the future. Yeah. And so that's basically what I'm focusing on now.
So it's in some ways leads into a question. Both of you have sort of narrated your intellectual journeys to the present at Grinnell College. And I know that you as I mentioned before, the two of you were instrumental in establishing a Black Studies department there. And so I'm curious how, and this may or may not sort of be deeply linked to your research, I'm curious how you imagine the field of Black studies, because, of course, it's one thing to be a professor in an existing department. It's another thing to be a professor who says we should have a department, and then somebody says, well, what is that? And you have to describe it. So I think both of you have probably thought more about this question than most people. But I asked a question about how you imagine Black studies as a field, in part because it has such an interesting twin origin, right? Political activism, radical students that had a deep link to community, but also to college students, and emphasizing the college side, and scattered faculty who were like, look, Black materials, whether it's literature or history or art, it's just not being represented in our curriculum. And we need to find a place to develop this Black intellectual tradition and appreciation of it and extend it. And so that commitment to an intellectual tradition, but also that political commitment to community impact, I always want to say it's a tension and not a contradiction, although I think for some people it is a kind of contradiction. But there's at least a tension there at its very origins. And so I'm curious to hear you both talk about how you imagine the field around this sort of double origin, and maybe start with you, Makeba.
Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. I think, it definitely is. I don't even know if I want to use the word tension. I would probably say dichotomy, right? Because I think about some of the things that I read when I was just sort of formulating my expression of Black studies and where my research would come to fit in that. And I think about the Combahee River statement, right? The personal is political. Basically everything is political. And so June Jordan called Black studies life studies. And I think it's really important to remember that, because history can't be segregated, right? It's you can't necessarily segregate what you're doing for politics with intellectual pursuits or historical realities. I think, the segregation sort of haunts what's not being mentioned, right? Like Sing Sing and Mad Men. We call people who kind of want to keep them separate conservative, but I think we need to be really clear about what they're trying to conserve, right?
Yeah,
what's being conserved.
Absolutely.
And how that poses a danger to all of us. And so some of us theorize, analyze, archive, Black life studies, how that fits into the larger national landscape, while others expose it creatively. And I think some people do both. And for me, that's the crux of what Black studies is. It's a remembrance, it's a reckoning, it's a path forward.
Stephanie?
Yeah, and I think Makeba is also a continuation of our theme of pettiness as well. I think of, I'm thinking about 1968 is a year that popped into my mind for a couple of reasons. Number one, that's
my
the year
birth year.
That's the year my mother graduated from high school. And that's also the year that, as I'm understanding it as a very new student to Black studies, that a lot of these programs are being demanded on college campuses, right? And so I think about my mother's experience of being the second cohort of integrated students at Newton County High School in Georgia, and thinking about the education that she should have received at that school that all of those families contributed to with their tax dollars, right? And I'm also thinking about the education that those Black students on those university campuses were demanding, but they were also not getting. And so I look at all of those things in the circle of curriculum violence, because curriculum violence can also include erasure. It can also include diminishing. It can also include someone really having a very forceful but wrong argument about why you don't need to be included in the curriculum, right? And I'm thinking about all of those things together in the sense that that's where my petty is coming out. It's because I want what I'm owed. And not only do I want what I'm owed, I realize that you don't have what I need to get it. And so you need to make a place for what it is that I want and what it is that I deserve. And I'm going to sit here until you get it. And so I think about the context of Grinnell College and their library takeover, which I believe was also in 1968, where they sat inside of the Burling Library and they had a list of demands that this is who we want, this is what we want hired, this is what we want in terms of a major, and you will give these things to us. And it wasn't until we got together as Black faculty and staff to demand those things almost 50 years later that we got them. So the pettiness is a long road, but we have long memory as well. So I feel like the field of Black studies is almost this constant reiteration of, I want what I'm owed. And we're going to get it. Yeah.
And I love that twist that you had about that twist that and you can't provide it. Makeba, go ahead.
John, you said something in one of the earlier podcast episodes that I listened to, which is that the students want this, right? The students are not the problem. It's the older people. And so I think, to Stephanie's point, when I took my students into the archives and when we talked about, because I teach African-American literature, the survey, we talked about, the takeover in 1968. Those students were enraged because they were literally like, these are the same things we're asking for now. Yeah. How do we not have them? How are we still starting from the same place that people, who are older than our parents, maybe even our grandparents, are starting from? How did we get here? And so now they're already looking at, older generations like, what is the holdup? What is it about this that you don't want us to have? And that's what we need to rectify.
That's good. It's a mobilizing transgenerational rage, right? To make something where things can be made. Yeah. That's a difficult path because, as I'm sure you guys could talk about for hours, the real creativity of institutions is throwing up roadblocks and impossibilities. I mean, it's 50-something years of it, right? But in the end, I mean, I'm probably going to keep coming back for years to with the way you put that, Stephanie, of like, you don't have what we want, so we have to make it. So we just need that place, and forcing that issue. Started with protest. I think that we've gotten to this very strange place of a lot of getting those kinds of things is now in the wake of violence and death. But also I think we as professors, and if we and any of us end up in administrative roles, we also have to think about, how can we activate this kind of passion and need that doesn't draw on death. And maybe the students don't have to risk themselves. Maybe at some point we do the right thing without this, but because it's exhausting. I mean, I'm sure you all. I mean, there's something super satisfying about seeing Black Studies appear on the Grinnell campus, but the way that name of the department conceals so much work and passion. And not to like turn this around to like my own story, my own talking, but when I was at Amherst College. Regularly, and when they would have the Black student reunion, Black students would come to the Black Studies department and talk about trying to agitate for that department or to expand it or to get it legitimacy. And the way decades later, they were fighting tears and anger because of these roadblocks and this inability to have like that space of creating. I think there's also this, I think about it a lot here at University of Maryland, like how can we actually also make our departments spaces that honor that sacrifice, right? Maybe a mural, right? Like it strikes me, I don't know what the people look like who did this at University of Maryland College Park or at Amherst College where I was before, but finding a way to be like, your passion, just like my time or your time, and energy was not for nothing, even if it had to be for somebody else. Goes to your futurist question, right? Sometimes we make things in the present for a time we don't see ourselves. I'm interested, maybe address this first to you, Stephanie. I'm interested in how you see your research in education studies. And Makeba, you work in literary studies. So they're very different in terms of disciplines as they're set out in a university or college setting. But bringing them under the umbrella of Black studies is always interesting to me. To then ask this question, starting with you, Stephanie, how do you see your research relating to the past of the field, but also what do you think it does to change something or alter or embellish the field? Because everything we do has some relation to what has gone on in the past, but also hopefully is something that pushes a boundary, that introduces something new.
Yeah, I think one thing that has been very key for me in putting these things together in my mind is that when I try to ask my mother about her experience of desegregating her high school with her cohort, it's an experience that she doesn't talk about. And I believe because it was probably definitely like emotionally traumatic for her. And I think what sticks with me about her narrative is she says things like, "This is not what we wanted." Like when I was at my other school with my Black teachers and my Black friends, we were cared for, we were loved. It was community, but we weren't given the resources, right? We know this story. So I think about that in terms of my main responsibility in my job is that I'm a teacher educator. So I train people to become teachers. So at Grinnell College, not only can you earn a degree while you're there, you also can earn a license to teach. Okay. And so I take that responsibility pretty seriously in the sense that what kind of teacher are you going to be? Are you going to be the teacher that was what my mother had in 1968? Are you going to be the one that was her community teacher before she had to move, right? Like, what are you bringing into the space that's going to help students continue the work of learning and loving the discipline that you're teaching, but also to help them to be critical, even in the midst of everything that's going on legislatively, what's going on in the environment, what's going on politics, so on and so forth. I must admit that it wasn't until I went on sabbatical and our department hired Dr. Robert Robinson, who's at CUNY, who specializes in that beautiful hybrid of Black studies in education, that I learned from him what were the beginning thinkers in this work, that Black people have been talking about how do we educate each other for a long time. And it did not, when I got my first syllabus kind of as a model, they were starting with Plato and Socrates. I'm sorry, but no. How is that helping me at this moment thinking about education? Yeah. And I was saying he was helping me to formulate in my mind that there are traditions, intellectual traditions. There are people who have been writing and thinking about these questions for a very long time. And he and I were able to reformulate our intro education syllabus to put that emphasis in there about these early traditions that we need to lean on that are asking really important questions about the study of Black life. In terms of the future and in terms of my work, I know my work is pretty, it's not fun to do, because what I do is that I actually track these incidents of curriculum violence and racialized trauma. Yeah. And I've taken a little bit of hiatus, but we're probably close to around 800 over the last 2 or 3 years that I've documented. And this could be anything from harassment, intimidation, bullying, physical violence, racial slurs, all of it, K through college, like you mentioned before. And what I need people to understand is that the study of Black life and learning about it through the lens of Black studies helps me understand kind of the immense pressure, the immense physiological and intellectual, what's the word that I'm looking for? It changes you. Every time I present this work to someone gets a memory unlocked in them about something that happened to them when they were in school.
Wow.
And so you think about what this does, how Black and brown students carry this type of legacy with them when they think about education. That's something that we haven't even dipped our toe into yet. That school for some people was a space of trauma. I think Michael Dumas writes about that as well. But I feel that I'm such a new student to Black studies that I'm still trying to articulate what is continuing to happen and what its impact is. But I'm pretty sure, because ain't nothing new under the sun, that people have written about this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I hope that answers your question.
No, I mean, that word you used that stuck with me was unlocked. You know, it wasn't like resonated. It was unlocked, this memory. And that says a lot about what, how, I mean, that in particular, but the way that is a window into this question of the political activism that comes inherent in taking Black life seriously. In this case, in the context of education and curriculum. I mean, it's like, that's activism in that moment that you say, both you're not alone, and that was outrageous, and it doesn't have to be that way. And here's the different, I mean, that's like, I mean, if you talk about like, what is politics and activism, it's like, here's what happened to you. It was wrong. Here's a different way.
Yeah.
And that has to be a part of that story of Black life, that Black studies, that's buried in that phrase, Black studies. Yeah. No, I love that. Makeba.
Yeah, and Stephanie, I love that you ended with there ain't nothing new under the sun, right? Because it reminds me of my favorite Octavia Butler quote. There's, nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns, right? And I think that's what I think of when I think of what it means to take Black life seriously and the inherent sort of political, intellectual intertwining of them, right? Because you have to imagine something new before you can sort of create that new thing. So my PhD is technically in English, but 90% of the classes that I took were in Black studies. And I was a research assistant to John Christian Suggs, who was developing an app called More Than a Map, which allowed for self-led historical tours of Black spaces in New York City, particularly Harlem, that were important to like writers and artists of the Harlem Renaissance, many of whom were lesser known. And so at the time, my advisor, Robert Reed Farr, was trying to get me to read more like 19th century, early 20th century Black fiction. And I wasn't having it. It's like, I'm an afrofuturist. Like that's what I want to do. I don't care about this old stuff. And working with Dr. Suggs was interesting because I realized, as a native New Yorker, I had passed so many of those landmarks that, he was putting on this app and had no idea of their historical significance to the city and to Black life, right? Both. And so that got me started on Charles Chestnut, because he wasn't taking no for an answer. He's like, if you're going to study anything related to Blackness, like you have got to have these foundational texts. So, he gave me Charles Chestnut, George Schuyler, Du Bois's fiction, Sudney Griggs. And that actually became sort of the foundation of my dissertation work. And the most amazing thing about these writers is that I realized that they were often writing fiction as a treatise or a blueprint. And I found that so fascinating. And that's why so many people are like, oh, this fiction's not good, right? But it's like the fiction is a ruse. Like they have ideas that they're trying to get across, and they find that more important. And so, that goes back to the Octavia Butler quote of writing herself in. Often these people were writing for their lives, literally, for their children's futures. And they were so bold about their visions. I was really surprised by how radical a lot of these texts that were written in the 18th century were. And so it brings me back to the idea that time does not equal progress. Progress is not linear, and progress is not passive. This is sort of this mantra that I tell myself and my students when I teach, because a lot of students come into class and they think, oh, it's the 21st century, racism is not that bad, quote unquote, whatever that means, right? And it's like, well, actually, let's read some of these older books and you can see where people were, where the ideas were, and we can talk about where we are now. So I think of like Du Bois writing The Comet, but also Returning Soldiers during the Red Summer of 1919, where he says, we return fighting this great war. We return from fighting. It's like we have to fight everywhere we go because of global anti-Blackness. And he's making this apparent not only in this article that he's writing in The Crisis, during one of the most deadliest times, in our country for Black people, but also, he publishes The Comet the next year. So it's like he's hitting us from both sides, right? You get this very interesting treatise, but you also get what that looks like literarily. And I think the important thing here, and the reason why I really love literary studies in terms of Black studies, is that these writers knew, intimately, they were doing their damnedest to capture people's attention and imagination in hopes of building a more equitable world. And that impulse, I think, is, to bring the question about, to the future, that impulse is timeless. And I think it'll serve us well as we look to the future. What are we imagining and how are we writing / fighting our way forward? And I think that's where we are now, especially, in the wake of this political moment. And so when I think of literary studies and teaching, I teach my students the same thing I was taught, which is question everything. I had a teacher who wrote that on the board the first day of every class. I took many classes with her. Read, write, think critically. How do we teach that? Especially now in the wake of AI, right? But it's more important than ever.
Yeah. And so thinking about, you opened up this question in when you said, you love literary study, and then you paused and then said, especially in a Black studies context. I don't know if you said especially, but in a Black studies context. So let me follow up and ask you about that, that you have your doctorate in English, and you're in an English department, you work with literature, but also this interest in and connection to Black studies, and how that disciplinary training and the methods and expectations that come with that, and the multidisciplinary milieu of Black studies, how is that relationship impacting you as a thinker and writer and also teacher?
Yeah, so, books are my first love, my first great love. I read everything. I used to get in trouble for reading when I was a kid because I would always read and then forget I had things that I was supposed to do. It's like, the garbage hasn't been taken out. You didn't wash those dishes, right? But I finished this book I've been reading for 8 hours straight. So I think,
my students are often like, why do you have so many books? I'm like, these are my oldest friends. Who lets them go?
The homies. Exactly.
It's actually true. I'm laughing, but I'm dead serious. Anyway, sorry.
And I'm sharing them with you. Be grateful. No, but yeah, I think about, my love for books is sort of, inextricable from the study of Black life, because all the books that I read in my formative years were by Black people. I was reading a lot of that urban fiction that you probably wrote about, Stephanie, in your dissertation. And so, in terms of where I am now at Grinnell, and in terms of my research, I'm a bit unruly. So for me, things are more connected than not. I know there are conventions of disciplines, and I follow them when I have to. But, what I love about Black studies is that, it really opens up what you want to research and what conventions you're using. There's not a single set of conventions. I think Martha Biondi talked about this, in her podcast episode, right? There are no set structures for how you research. So you bring in your literary studies conventions, the close reading, the archival work, all of that into the study. And I definitely teach that, and I teach African American survey and the African American senior seminar. We always go to the library and look at those archives and other archives if we can, and get that firsthand experience. I think it's so important for them to understand that these were real people, real people with real issues, some of which we still have today, which is how I had the students who were upset about 1968 and seeing the parallels to their own struggles at Grinnell. So in classes, I have had to reel that in because they're English classes and be a bit more literary. But I find that reading, writing, and thinking critically are just such necessary skills for Black studies, but, ultimately for life. I mean, we are living in the age of misinformation. And so, if you are reading something, particularly if you're reading something negative about a person's identity, do you have the skill to figure out whether or not this is the truth? Do you have the skill? Most of the students that I teach, whether it's African American literature or not, are white. Do you have the skill or the desire even to set aside what has been taught to you, formally and informally, about Blackness and the experience of Blackness in order to actually learn what is true? And that's what we have to start on day one. So I think, with with Black studies, I'll be able to teach some of my courses more interdisciplinarily in a way that I haven't, like my Miscegenation Nation short course that I taught last spring. But for now, it's really focusing on the critical reading, writing, and thinking that I think, unfortunately, many people don't have and don't necessarily want to cultivate.
And speaking of other podcasts, just today, one came out with John Murillo. And one of the things he had said about, and it resonated with what you were saying about literary study, is he said, the imperative of close reading is exactly the kind of diagnostic precision you need to address those questions that you're talking about. Like, can you read identity closely and not have a broad kind of whatever, but also the way that folds instantly into politics, right? It ends up not being about novels or about cultural texts alone, but also about, what it means to walk out your door. Yeah. So Stephanie, how about you? In many Black studies departments, history and literature, I think, are really central. And so I'm curious to hear you talk about the disciplinary demands of education studies, which I know is in some ways its own area study, right? Because it does draw on sociology, anthropology, and others. But sort of what it is for you to go from education studies and Black studies back and forth.
I think after being at Grinnell for, at least until maybe my fourth year, I started putting a little bit of a statement inside of my syllabus that reminded the students in the class that there is no Black studies department or course that you can take at this college. Therefore, I feel that it is part of my responsibility to make sure that what we are reading in here is centered on the study of Black life and education. I feel like that's the least that I can do. And also, it's a little bit of it's a way that I get to study the things that I did not get an opportunity to study along with them. And I think that Makeba brings up a great point, is like, how do you do this work in a predominantly white space? And I feel like I do have a little expertise because that's the only type of schooling experience I've ever had. And so what does it mean for me to come in and talk to white students about this work and for them to have a sustained conversation about race as a white person? I feel like just as we think it's necessary for critical reading and writing, that also needs to be a part of those requirements for students, especially students who claim to be liberal, who claim to be non-racist, non-anti-Black, all of these things. And I had a professor recently say to me that, we need to stop using the term white fragility. I know people have broken that apart a long time ago, but she was thinking about it in terms of it's really white dissociation. And we are working to help white students, white faculty, to stop disassociating from their pain that they're not acknowledging. And when I bring certain readings into the class, when I talk about, for example, James Anderson's work and how he studied the movement of Black families in the South to get public education for everybody. That what we know as a public school at this moment would not be done without the work of Southern Black families and communities. For them to sit and wrestle with that idea that they have attributed to, I don't know, Horace Mann, Johnny Appleseed, whoever they want to characterize as being the founders of this great system.
It's a great pairing, yes.
like you have to think that there are so many, there's so much Black labor that we have rendered invisible here that allows you to be in this room. And it not only allows you to be in this room, but it allows you to be in this room with me. And that it's not a coincidence that I'm your first Black teacher and you're 18 or 20 or almost on your way out of Grinnell. I love to think about it in terms of how I assess students, in that I don't use necessarily traditional assessments, like writing papers, but I had them do a timeline of how they got into this room. Like, you need to go back in time and tell us how you showed up at Grinnell and enrolled in this class. But the caveat with this is that you have to have events and people on the timeline that were there before you were born. Because I don't want you to attribute all of your success to you. I don't want you to attribute all of your success to you being smart, because that's what college admissions tells them. You're the best. We want you. And we'll even give you a little money to come on over here. But I need them to know that it wasn't even about that. There was some stuff before you, and probably even before your parents, that got you up here in this room. And I need you to understand that that's why this room looks the way that it does. And who else has something to say? And I think the more that I'm starting to read more in depth about Black studies, that's helping me, because I don't want our students to get into paralysis around things, because Black folks couldn't afford to be paralyzed or stunned about any of these things. We had to act. We had to come together. We had to do these things to make our lives sustainable. So I think that's where my little mashup is coming in.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, both of your responses, I think, also draw out. I mean, it's a phrase that, I'm sure it has a history I'm just unaware of, but it's like critical storytelling, right? Which embeds in social scientific, significance, history, literature, but also how to tell those stories. Because this is not necessarily the place for it, but I would be fascinated to hear how those students even approach telling a story that's not their admissions, self-aggrandizement, right? And those are embarrassing things to even, I mean, I have a kid in college, and like watching him write those, I was just like, what? Who's that? It's like, but also a little bit about, what about us? What about these others, So I mean, we don't have those habits of storytelling that gather history, literature, data, communities, hidden stories, as you say. Because even just that moment of like the effort of Southern Black families. I mean, just that phrase, when you said it, I was like, that's not a critical category that I see circulating, but it really ought to be, because we have a whole different world because of that. Yeah. And how to make those not a part of the story of the past alone, but also part of the present and future, to pick up with so much of what Makeba has been saying. And that's a Black Studies project, right? It changes our relationship to time and stories, I think. And so maybe this is actually already, you've both maybe already given a good bit of this answer, but I wanted to ask you a speculative question, or whatever you want to call it. What do you think that Black Studies in its past has done particularly well, and what do you think it hasn't done particularly well? Maybe start with you, Makeba.
I mean, I think, I'm going to say the obvious, right? Persevere. I think figuring out ways to continue to exist in the present and the future, and to get people to understand why it's important to have Black Studies in the first place, not just in a separate department, but in education, in English, in sociology, why it's important to look at the study of Black life and Black living in all of these different spaces, right? I think, I don't necessarily want to say this is a failure of the program, but I think the answer is the same, and that, what needs to continue to be done is that going forward, these things have to be entrenched across the entire university. And I feel like, John, you've talked about that explicitly when you visited Grinnell, right? Like, as a way forward for the program itself. I think a lot of the pushback is, in certain social sciences and hard sciences, what does that have to do with us? What does the study of Black life and Black living have to do with us? And I find that question to be disingenuous in the same way as, when people say something like, well, what does that have to do with race? Everything has to do with race and racism, racial formations. So therefore, the study of Black life and Black living has to show up everywhere. And I think, that's what needs to happen moving forward.
It's hard to get it to show up everywhere for those reasons that you just said, because the resistance is a way of pulling a shade or a veil over it constantly, but it lives back there. Yeah. Stephanie, what about you?
I mean, I think this podcast to me is one of the ways that Black Studies is doing particularly well. Like, I feel like this podcast is making things accessible, and I'm learning so much just from listening to it myself. And I think the more accessible and the more we put our work out there and not use, we're gonna have to use the master's tools for a second, get this melon money so y'all can create this podcast and put it out there and be accessible.
There you go. Exactly.
Right, exactly. But, academia is not so far from being an arm of the state. So we got to be careful about that whole business. Absolutely. Right. But I think, I don't know about the field of of Black Studies, but I feel like I want to judge it by when I talk to my family members who are not academics and I hear them talk about Black folks. There is still we still got a lot of work to do. And I am very deeply concerned about how much anti-Blackness has just latched on to even how Black people talk about our own people. And I know Black Studies as a discipline has talked about these things, right? But it's like, how can we get that message out more about what anti-Blackness is doing to us, in particular? I hear statements consistently. You ever get that thing where people on the airplane ask you what you do for a living? Have y'all started lying yet? Like not telling people.
I've thought about it. Yes.
Yeah, I stopped telling people that I was a teacher, and then I stopped telling people that I was a professor of education, because then people tend to want to share what they think are the solutions
Oh,
to
jeez. Yeah.
my discipline, right?
Mhm.
But
I
I
used
say
to be
that.
in philosophy departments, and so I'd say philosophy professor and say, let me tell you about my philosophy in like 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours. I'm like, I know we're over the Atlantic, but let me out.
Just let me out. I'll find a way to get there. I'll find a way, because I can't do it. I can't do it. But the reason that I brought that question up is because um, I have had people share with me some of the most anti-Black sentiment, but with such good intentions, and especially around education of Black children. Oh, Black kids don't need AP. They need to do something with their hands.
Mm-hmm.
What? And they said it so proud, like, or why are we the ones walking in the store with a bonnet on? And I tried, and there is everything in me that tries to tell me, baby, I live in Iowa. I live in Iowa. Can I tell you what I see when I see people in the store? Why the vitriol for the bonnet and not, okay, so we don't have to go there today, but I just want, that's what I want a little bit more of, more conversation around, is how that has seeped into what we know. Makeba, you got something?
Yeah, so it reminded me of something I wanted to say earlier. Also, coalitions. I'm so glad that you brought up like the anti-Blackness, right? But I think if we think about like turn of the century, so much of that work was global, right? Having coalitions in Europe, on the continent, in Cuba and what have you. And knowing that history, it makes me sad when I hear a lot of people of color and Black people adopting this anti-immigration rhetoric, right? It's like, we know as Black people that we are sort of the blueprint for how to treat people terribly, oppress people in society, right? The Nazis will tell you, right, where a lot of that stuff came from. And so I feel like we know that, and a lot of us internalize that, and then sort of like push that outward at any given opportunity. But I feel like a lot of what was done so well and documented in early studies of Black life was that, we are all sort of under the same heel. And how do we sort of bridge the gap of our oppression and focus all of that vitriol where it belongs? And it's not with ourselves or each other. And so I feel like, moving forward, we need to do more of that community work. And I think it does start with a lot of that like theoretical translation, because we also know that a lot of the theory comes from the praxis that people have been living for much longer than somebody writes it down and publishes it, right? And I think, moving forward, we need to find more ways to continue that work and not just get, kind of mired down in the academy.
Yeah, I have to say on that this is something that I've found over the years. If you bring up that very question with students, they're beating each other up in student groups around these questions, whether it's African American Student Union, the Caribbean and African Student Union, or trying to figure out how to, have some sort of connection to, whatever, like Latinx studies, identity groups, area studies, departments. And they have, they're looking for ways to talk about this, in my experience. And when they look to me, I think a lot of what you're saying, which is I don't have a lot of thoughts on that. And that's actually a problem, right? I don't have a lot of materials I could give them. I can just like come up with a couple of famous sort of late 60s, early 70s activists, go read their writings or something. But I think that's a tough horizon, and it's something that we absolutely have to do because, as you said, there's a blueprint there, right? But it also goes to the heart of what Stephanie was saying about the complexity of Black life also has these moments of internal fracture and critique that are really hard to talk about, right? In moments of being under siege. Let me back up. So I'm just increasing in some ways speculative questions. And let me ask this question about the future of Black studies and really what would constitute a sign of its success as a field. As we were talking about before, the origins of the field is lack of representation in the disciplines. Right, the Black life is just absent from curricula, and Black studies departments come as a cure for that, or at least a patch up of that. Is a sign of the success of Black studies that eventually it's no longer needed, that the disciplines are so transformed, whether in this case of the two of you, literary studies and critical education studies, that they become so transformed that you don't need Black studies anymore? Or is there something about the phenomenon of the field of Black studies 50 years plus in that it's become something that's actually indispensable and can't be dispersed back into disciplines? Maybe start with you, Makeba.
Oh, why I always got to start?
Because you're the futurist. This is a future question. You should never have said you worked in futurist studies.
No, I gotta play some things close to the chest. I like this, the end part of the question, which is, can it be dispersed, right? Is it dispersed or is it central? And I think I've been doing a lot of work to not be an either or person. I just feel like it's white supremacist thinking, to have dichotomous thinking all the time. I think we need both, but I think, I'm hopeful that maybe the reasons why we need both will change. So right now, we need both because we need receipts. And we need some safer places. We need some archivists, some keepers of memory, because of exactly what we're going through right now, where people are like, let's not talk about identity. It's always, like Black and brown identity that we don't talk about, right? I guess white people don't have an identity. Like, nobody ever says, let's not play identity politics when we talk about white people. Even though our entire world is built around the politics of white identity, which is another thing.
Cisgendered people don't have pronouns. It's this incredible work of erasure of basic
exactly.
things, yeah.
I've literally seen people on social media shut down conversations by saying, "Oh, you have pronouns in your bio." It's like everyone. Anyway, but that's not the point. The point we're getting at right now. I think, I would hope that, I think there's still so much work to do. I mean, if we go back to the earlier question of how do we disperse, right, some of that Black life necessity and information and research, innovation, right, about Black life and living in like physics departments and math departments. And, because I think what we learn as studies, as people who do Black studies is that like, there are so many innovations that we don't know about. We have this lie in our, country that everything that's great comes from white people. And when you start studying, Black people and Black history, you realize it's not true at all. It's usually like, a person of color or a Black person, and then like a white person steals it. Or it's at a time when like, Black people couldn't have patents. And so, whoever was close to them steals it. Right. And so that's what frustrates me so much when like, I hear like someone in a science department or a social science being like, well, how do we incorporate this? It's like, how did your department start? How did you become a discipline? What were those actual foundations? And so before we think about getting rid of Black studies as its sort of like own thing, we have to come to terms with the truth and the real history that we can uncover for all these other disciplines. And I think, you all know, like, we're still very much into like, we don't know where to begin. Everybody's a researcher, for a living until it comes time, to research something to do with Black life. All of a sudden, your physics degree fails you. It's like, oh, I can't do it.
All of a sudden, they forgot what a library is.
Yes. They've forgotten what a source is, a citation, and so I think we first have to deal with all of that. And if we get to a point in the future where we can be honest about what this country is and how it came to be and everyone's true, contributions to it, for better or worse, maybe we can talk about, I hate the word integration for reasons, but maybe we can talk about what it means to not necessarily have a separate Black Studies department.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, Makeba. I feel like even in our friendship that Makeba and I have, like sometimes I'm like, yes, you are the futurist, but I'm going to stay back and make sure that nobody forgets. And I know that I have like a personal and a professional like latch onto the idea of remembering. And I do not want people to forget. And I am very attached to the idea that when you were bringing up that word archiving, like doing that critical work of archiving things so that we can go back and have our memory be unlocked again, is very important to me. So I kind of don't trust the idea of a Black Studies department not being necessary ever. Because I feel like that might be, I don't know, it feels like a little bit of a game. It feels shiesty. Like, why you want me to not have it? You want me to be absorbed into this? Like, I always feel like there's some trickery around it. But I mean, but that's just me being skeptical. But I think also what I'm learning about Black intellectual life is like that skepticism keeps us alive too. Like, nah, I ain't about to do this, or I'm not about to go down there. I think about William Liu's work that's at University of Maryland. He writes that article, Places That Feel Racist. Like, I go into a place, you don't even have to say a word to me, and I know, oh, this is not where I belong. That's the type of stuff that I know has been instrumental to my survival and my people's survival. And when I think about what it means for us to study this work, I don't want that instinct to ever get lost in that. So, yeah, I'm okay. I want us to exist in the past, present, and the future. But I know I'm going to stay right here while y'all go ahead. Yeah,
it's interesting. For me, I'm in a Black Studies department, and also 49%, because they're very precise in the bureaucracy, and 49% in the English department. But in some ways, English departments, especially at large universities, are kind of like area studies. And so I've had students say, well, I feel like I'm kind of getting a Black Studies education in the English department. But I'm always like, well, and but then I think also about like, well, wouldn't it be amazing that you could get a Black Studies education in all the departments and also a Black Studies department? Because you do different things. And what you both said, and I think, just to pick up on what you said last bit, Stephanie, about it has like an indifferent intuitive horizon. Right. It's like these intuitions of a Black Studies department are entirely inside Black life, and not like an intuition among many. And I mean intuition in the strongest sense, that like this is a dangerous place to be Black. Right. And what does that say? Right. How does white literature get read in a Black Studies context versus an English context? all of which speak to, I think, really emergent methodologies, but also more deeply sensibilities in Black studies, which can be really difficult to describe. I've always worried that someday I'll be chair and some dean will say, explain in detail a Black studies sensibility. I'll pass that on to a colleague or something, but it's really real. I think there's real substance there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask a last question. Which is very, not so much speculative, but this sort of moment to center yourselves in the field of Black studies and say, in terms of the institution, right, of Black studies as a field of study at universities and in our intellectual life, what is the question you want us all to be asking? Stephanie, I'll go first with you since Makeba. Why do I got to go first?
It's such a powerful question, and I appreciate you asking it. And I want to say this as a vocal reminder to myself to continue to ask this of myself, because I think this question is going to get it's going to change and it's going to become more refined. So I'm happy about the idea of playing around with it. But I am reminded of a question that Maisha Nguyen, who's at UC Davis, asked of English teachers. She says, is there a way for us to teach English? Is there a way to teach English in a way where we stop killing each other? And that question kind of rocked me because I never thought about what my role is as an English teacher and helping to save or to stop harming each other. And I think I would probably rephrase that question a little bit for now, because my research trajectory has led me into not only curriculum violence and racialized trauma and memory, but now I'm dipping into clinical mental health work. So now this question is like, how do we teach Blacks? How do we teach Black studies in a way where we can heal? I think is a question that I would like to ask. Yeah. Or how can we teach Black studies in a way where we remember what's important for us? Or how can we always be in pursuit of studying Black life? I think is another one. Yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
I have sort of a personal research question that's guiding me right now, and then also a general Black studies question. And the personal research question is, what are the limits of representation and how can we contend with them? So that's back to my Miscegenation Nation book project, right? A lot of it is we're reckoning with Black faces in high places, as some people say, right? And how that doesn't necessarily change the institutions in any way that matters. It's instead just co-opts some of our more radical ideas and defangs them. So that's that. And then the general guiding question is actually from Tony K. Bambara, and it's, what are we pretending not to know today? The first time I heard that question, I felt like it just hit me with a sledgehammer.
Slap in the face.
And I always come back to that because, when I have students or just generally people who kind of grumble, because I too have had students who are like, I thought I was taking in, this class, a literature class, and it turns out it's secret sociology, right? Like, what is this? Like, you can teach African-American literature without all of the sociological historical background, right? But if we think about this essential question, what are we pretending not to know today? And I ask my students this, I think back on Black studies and how it fills a gap. And there's a meme of Ruby Bridges being surrounded by those federal agents. And it says, if Black children were old enough to experience it, your children are old enough to know about it. And I think about the fact that Ruby Bridges is 69 years old, still
That's
out
not
here.
Very old.
It's not
just
very
not that
old at all. She's barely old enough to be my mother. And so this idea that, there's so much that we're pretending not to know on a daily basis. And that's why Black Studies is so important, because it fills in those gaps.
I love that. Wonderful place to conclude. And I love that meme. I always feel like it should put so many quote debates to rest. I mean, it's just it's a meme, but it's profound remark. And just for posterity's sake, 69 years old right now would be the far and away the most youthful presidential candidate.
Yo,
Oh my! By far,
please.
Sorry, it's to bring up sort of the terror of our political curriculum these days. But seriously, I really love both of you and really respect the work you do. And I appreciate you making the time, but I really mostly appreciate just how thoughtful and insightful this conversation has been. This is like a lot to think about. I've really enjoyed being a part of it. People are going to love listening to it and talking about it. So thank you so much for your time. It's been really excellent. I really love this.
thank you for having
so
us.
much.
All right. Take care. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye.